The Caruso estate hadn't seen chaos like this in 36 years. 24 of the world's most decorated physicians were crammed into a nursery that cost more than most people's homes. White coats blurring beneath Venetian chandeliers. Heart monitors screamed. Ventilators hissed. A team from Mayo Clinic barked orders at specialists flown in from Zurich, while a Nobel laureate in pediatric toxicology pressed his stethoscope to a tiny chest and whispered what no one wanted to hear. "We're losing him." Baby Nico Caruso, 8 months old, sole heir to an empire of pharmaceutical patents, waterfront real estate, and the kind of power that never showed up on a tax return, was dying. $50,000 an hour in medical expertise, and not a single soul could explain why his body had turned the color of a bruised evening sky. Blue lips, blue fingertips, a mottled rash creeping across his chest like a silent accusation. Every test came back inconclusive. Every treatment failed. His father stood 3 feet from the crib, fists clenched white. Emilio Caruso, the name that could empty a courtroom or shut down a city block. And right now he looked like exactly what he was. A father watching his only child die and unable to do a damn thing about it. And through the servant's entrance, pressing her face against glass that had never been cleaned for someone like her, stood a girl the world had taught to be invisible. Willa Mercer, 10 years old, daughter of the night shift maid. Wearing her mother's oversized coat because she didn't own one that fit, shoes so worn the pavement bit through every time it rained. She'd spent her entire life on the edges of this estate, the girl who noticed everything because nobody ever noticed her. She knew every camera blind spot, every unlocked door during the 3 o'clock shift change, every shadow safe enough to breathe in. Right now her hands were trembling because she was staring at something 24 geniuses had walked past without a second glance. The potted plant on the nursery windowsill. The one that arrived 3 days ago. The one that left an oily yellow residue on the gardener's gloves. Gloves that touched the baby's crib railing during yesterday's wipe down. Her great-grandmother, Dorothy Harlan, who'd healed half of Appalachia's poorest hollow with nothing but herbs and hands that smelled like lavender and wood smoke, had taught her to recognize that leaf before she could write her own name. Oleander. Every petal, every stem, every drop of sap, pure poison, beautiful enough to gift, deadly enough to kill an infant without leaving a trace. Modern medicine knew how to find. The doctors were about to crack open that baby's chest, looking for answers. The answer was sitting in a ceramic pot, wrapped with a satin bow. Willa looked at the window, then at the armed guard making rounds, then at her mother's face through the kitchen door. Jolene Mercer, 29, a woman who'd survived a husband who used her face as a punching bag, and a world that treated her like furniture. The woman who told her 1,000 times, "Stay invisible. Stay safe. Don't give them a reason to throw us out." Willa thought about what would happen if she was wrong. Out on the street by morning, her mother fired, blacklisted, a Connecticut winter closing in with nowhere to go. Then she thought about what would happen if she was right and did nothing. Her great-grandmother's voice hit her like a church bell. "When you know how to save a life and you don't, child, you ain't no different from the one who took it." Willa pulled her mother's coat tight, took one breath that burned all the way down, and ran. What would you risk to save a life the whole world says isn't yours to save? If this story already has its hooks in you, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Because this little girl just ran straight into a world of power, blood, and secrets, and nothing on the Caruso estate will ever be the same. Jolene Mercer learned how to become invisible long before she ever set foot in the Caruso estate. She grew up in a narrow valley deep in Appalachia, a place the maps forgot to name and the phone lines never bothered to reach, in a crooked wooden house wedged between 2 bare hills, where winter winds cut straight through the walls, as if the walls didn't exist at all. Her mother left when Joe was 5, leaving behind nothing but a pair of fake silver earrings and the smell of cheap perfume lingering on a pillow for a few days before it faded too. Joe never knew her father, never saw his face, never heard anyone speak his name, and she never asked, because she understood that some questions carry wounds inside the answers themselves. The woman who raised her was her grandmother, Dorothy Harlan, a small, framed woman with rough hands that always smelled of lavender and burnt wood, the woman the entire valley called Dot and turned to whenever someone fell sick without money for a doctor, whenever someone was bitten by a snake or burned with fever in the middle of the night, while the nearest hospital sat 3 hours away down dirt roads. Dot healed with herbs, with remedies passed through 4 generations of women, with her hands and her faith, and the patience of someone who had seen too much suffering to still be afraid of it. She taught Joe the names of leaves before Joe could properly read or write. Taught her to tell a healing plant from a deadly one by the feel of a leaf and the scent of its sap. Taught her that knowledge was the one thing no one could take away, even if they took everything else. Joe loved her with the absolute love only abandoned children know how to give to the one person who didn't abandon them. Then Joe turned 18, and Bryce Mercer arrived. He came to the valley to work for a logging company. Tall, blue-eyed, easy smile, full of promises about a different life. A life with streetlights and grocery stores and a future. Dot looked at him with the eyes of someone who had known too many kinds of poison and told Joe, "There are plants so beautiful you want to bring them into your home, but touch them and your skin blisters. Remember that." Joe remembered, but Joe was 18, and at 18 everyone thinks they're different. Everyone thinks they'll be the exception. She followed Bryce to a small town 4 hours away. The first 6 months he was gentle. In the 7th month he hit her for the first time, a slap after dinner because the food was too salty. And then he held her and cried and begged forgiveness. And Joe believed him because Joe wanted to believe, and because Joe had no one else left to believe in. By the 10th month, the beatings no longer needed reasons. Bryce hit her drunk, hit her sober, hit her when Joe spoke, and hit her when Joe stayed silent. She hid bruises under long sleeves in the middle of summer, and told the neighbors she'd fallen down the stairs even though their apartment was on the ground floor. When Joe discovered she was pregnant, she thought the baby would change everything. Bryce stared at the test with its 2 lines, said nothing, took all the cash from the drawer, and disappeared on a Tuesday morning while Joe was asleep. He left no letter, no explanation, nothing but 3 months of overdue rent notices and a bruise on her cheekbone that hadn't yet faded. Joe returned to the valley with her belly already round, one suitcase in her hand, stood at Dot's door, and cried for the first time since her mother left 14 years earlier. Dot didn't ask a single question. She opened the door, pulled Joe inside, laid a hand on her belly, and said, "This child will be strong," because her mother survived. Willa was born on a November night. Dot delivered her right there in the house because the snow was too heavy to drive anywhere, and the baby's first cry echoed through the valley as if she wanted the whole world to know she had arrived. Dot taught Willa everything she knew, starting before the child could walk, carrying her into the garden, placing leaves into tiny palms, naming each one in a voice soft as a lullaby. Then Dot died. Willa was 7 when Dot fell in the garden on an autumn afternoon, still holding a sprig of lavender, eyes turned toward the sky, and by the time Joe ran outside, she was already gone, gentle and quiet the same way she had lived. Joe buried her on the hill behind the house, stood by the grave with Willa in her arms, and understood that she truly had no one left in the world except the 7-year-old girl asking why great-grandma wouldn't wake up anymore. 2 years later, with the money gone and Appalachian winters showing no mercy to those without heat, Joe heard from an acquaintance that the Caruso estate in Connecticut needed a night housekeeper, room and board included, a place where a small child was allowed. Joe didn't know who the Carusos were. She didn't ask. She only knew there would be a roof and food for Willa, and for a mother who had lost everything, that was enough to say yes. She took Willa onto a Greyhound bus with 1 suitcase and $42 in her pocket. And during the 11-hour ride, she repeated the same sentence to her daughter that she would whisper every night for the past year. "We're blessed, sweetheart. Never forget that." The Caruso estate stretched across 40 acres of rolling land in the northern hills of Greenwich, Connecticut. And the first time Joe saw it through the window of a Greyhound bus, she thought she must be looking at a photograph torn from a magazine. Wrought iron gates rose higher than 4 meters, bearing the Caruso family crest cast in bronze. A stone-paved drive curved through 2 perfectly trimmed rows of red maples cut leaf by leaf with obsessive care. Gardens designed by a landscape architect whose work had graced the covers of 3 architecture magazines. An Italian imported fountain, with marble angels pouring water day and night, even though no one ever stood to admire it. A swimming pool shaped like the family crest. Tennis courts, a helicopter landing pad, and a 12-car garage holding vehicles worth 100 times more than the crooked wooden house where Joe had grown up. A wine cellar lay beneath the east wing of the mansion, temperature controlled year-round, storing bottles older than Dot would have been if she were still alive. Joe took it all in on her first day and thought she had arrived on another planet. A planet where people spent more on fountains than she would earn in an entire lifetime. But it took a few weeks before Joe began to understand that the Caruso estate wasn't only about money. There were things not written into any employment contract. a soundproof meeting room in the basement that no housekeeper was allowed to approach, a concrete tunnel leading from beneath the garage toward the shoreline, which Joe glimpsed once and never again because it was hidden behind a rotating wine cabinet, more security cameras than windows, and men in dark suits, guns tucked beneath their arms, patrolling 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, faces set as if they'd forgotten how to smile a long time ago. Joe didn't ask questions. Joe never asked anything, because asking meant curiosity, and curiosity meant existing, and existing meant being noticed, and being noticed in a place like this wasn't a good thing. But she listened. The house staff talked in the kitchen when they thought no one was paying attention, and from those whispered fragments, Joe pieced together the portrait of the man she worked for, but had never met. Emilio Caruso, 36 years old, the only son of Giovanni Caruso, a boss who had built an empire from a small pharmacy in Brooklyn 50 years earlier and turned it into a web of pharmaceutical patents, coastal real estate, and a kind of power that flowed beneath the surface of legitimacy, like groundwater beneath stone. Giovanni died of cancer 8 years earlier, and Emilio inherited everything at 28, becoming the youngest boss in the history of the 5 major families on the East Coast, and according to the head chef whispering to the butler late one night, the most ruthless of them all, not because he enjoyed violence, but because he felt nothing when he used it. They said Emilio Caruso could order a man killed and sit down to dinner without changing the rhythm of his chewing. They said he never raised his voice because he didn't need to, that the quieter he spoke, the more afraid people should be. They said he could read others the way one reads a book, knowing who was lying before they reached their second sentence. And they spoke of Celeste, his wife, the only woman who could make Emilio Caruso smile without anyone having to pay for that smile. Celeste Montoya, the daughter of a university professor, not from the Mafia world, not from any world Emilio knew, and perhaps that was exactly why he loved her the way a man who had lived in darkness loves the light, desperately and greedily, and knowing he didn't deserve it but couldn't let go. Celeste was pregnant with Nico, and everyone in the estate said it was the first time they had ever seen Emilio happy, truly happy, the kind of happiness that made a killer walk more softly down the halls and ask the cook what a pregnant woman should eat for the baby's health. Then, 8 months earlier, on a rain-slicked stretch of Interstate 95 at 11 o'clock at night, Celeste's car was forced into the median by an unmarked black SUV at a speed of 120 kilometers per hour. The police called it an accident. Emilio called it a murder he hadn't yet avenged. Celeste bled to death in the driver's seat, but when the ambulance arrived, her heart kept beating for a few minutes on machines, long enough for surgeons to cut Nico from her womb right there in the back of the emergency vehicle, the baby crying his first cry as his mother took her last breath. From that night on, according to the butler's trembling whispers, Emilio Caruso never smiled again. He didn't cry at the funeral. He didn't cry when he held Nico for the first time. He didn't cry when he stood before Celeste's grave. Every Sunday, with a bouquet of white flowers, he placed himself, standing there for 15 minutes before turning away without a word. His emotions froze completely, as if the human part of Emilio had died alongside Celeste on that rain-soaked highway, leaving behind only a machine, cold, precise, and more dangerous than ever, because a man with nothing left to lose has nothing left to fear. Only one thing kept him from the edge of that abyss: Nico. His 8-month-old son, lying in a gold-trimmed nursery, guarded around the clock, cared for by rotating teams of nurses, watched by Emilio through security cameras every night before he sat at his desk until morning. Joe knew all of this without anyone ever telling her directly. She listened and assembled and understood, and she kept it all to herself because that was how she survived. The way she had always survived, by knowing more than people thought she knew and saying less than they thought she could say. Willa first noticed Nico on a September morning, 3 months before everything collapsed. She was walking to the school bus stop along the path behind the estate, the one her mother had told her to use because it stayed far from the main areas where the Caruso family lived, when she caught a glimpse through the second-floor nursery window of a nurse lifting a tiny baby into the early morning sunlight. Nico. She only knew his name from the fragments her mother let slip when she was too tired to guard her words, that the baby had lost his mother at birth, that Mr. Caruso employed an entire team of nurses, rotating in 8-hour shifts, that a nutrition specialist had been flown in from Switzerland just to advise on which formula came closest to breast milk. Willa stopped for about 10 seconds, long enough to see the baby raise a small hand to touch the ray of sunlight cutting through the glass. Then she lowered her head and kept walking, because lingering was a risk, and risk was a luxury a night housekeeper's daughter wasn't allowed to have. But the next morning she slowed her steps a little when she passed that window, and the morning after that, and the one after that, until stopping for 30 seconds each morning to watch Nico greet the sun became part of her routine, as natural as tying her shoes or counting her steps from the house to the bus stop, 422 if she walked normally, 380 if she hurried. She counted, because counting was how she controlled a world where she controlled nothing else. She didn't understand why she felt drawn to that baby. Nico had everything she didn't: a lineage, an empire, a room larger than the entire house she shared with her mother, and a team of people ready to die to protect him. But there were mornings when she saw Nico lying alone in his crib, eyes open, not crying, staring up at the gold leaf ceiling with a look an 8-month-old baby shouldn't have, the look of waiting for a familiar hand that would never come again, because that hand had gone cold on Interstate 95, 8 months earlier. And Willa understood. She understood in the way only children without mothers can understand children who have lost theirs. She understood that Nico lay inside a golden cage, while she stood outside the fence. But both of them were looking out through their own windows at a world they didn't belong to. Nico would grow up with the Caruso name on his shoulders, with an empire and enemies, and walls of bodyguards separating him from everything ordinary. Willa would grow up in the shadows, skirting walls, learning how not to make noise, learning how to exist without leaving traces. 2 children, 2 prisons, 2 sentences written long before they could read, on the same 40-acre estate, where the distance between the gold-trimmed nursery and the servants' quarters was only 200 meters, yet farther than any ocean. On some afternoons after school, Willa would sneak around the eastern gardens just to watch the nanny push Nico's stroller, and she found herself smiling when Nico reached out to grab a leaf, worrying when he coughed softly in the autumn wind, whispering the words Dot once said, "Every child comes into this world pure, sweetheart. What happens after that is on us adults." Willa didn't know that the invisible thread tying her to the baby in the golden cage would soon pull her straight into the eye of the storm. She didn't know that 3 months of silent watching, 3 months of counting steps and stopping for 30 seconds each morning, would be the thing that saved Nico Caruso's life. She only knew that she was an invisible 10-year-old girl, and Nico was an 8-month-old baby without a mother, and sometimes that was enough for 2 people to belong to each other without anyone's permission. Then came that Tuesday afternoon, and everything changed. The servants' side door in the west wing of the mansion stayed unlocked for about 4 minutes each day, precisely when the afternoon shift changed to the night shift at 3 o'clock. And Willa knew this because she had counted, watched, and carved it into her memory through hundreds of passes over the past year, living at the edge of this estate. She had never used that knowledge until now. Her shoes touched the marble floor of the servants' corridor, and the first sound she heard was her own heart, beating so fast she thought someone was knocking from inside her chest, trying to get out. The corridor was long and narrow, whitewashed walls without decoration, fluorescent lights instead of chandeliers. This was the backside of the Caruso estate, the side guests never saw, the side meant for people like her mother, people who existed to serve and then disappear before anyone had to remember they were there. Willa ran. Her worn shoes slapped against the marble, each step echoing through the empty corridor. And she knew the sound of her footsteps was breaking every rule her mother had taught her, that she was making noise, taking up space, existing loudly for the first time in her life. And each step carried her closer to either disaster or salvation, and she didn't know which. Left at the corridor junction, past the laundry room, past the linen storage, to the service staircase leading up to the second floor. She had mapped this route in her head hundreds of times while skirting walls, while pretending to fetch things for her mother, while counting steps and doors and cameras, because counting was the only way she ever felt any power in a place where she had none. 17 steps, turn right. The second floor corridor, and now she could hear it. The noise, the machines, the shouted orders, the chaos bleeding through the heavy wooden door at the end of the hall, the door to the nursery, where Nico was dying and 24 doctors were losing a battle they didn't understand why they were losing. Willa ran to the door, and 2 walls of flesh stopped her. 2 guards, each at least 5 times her weight. Black suits, earpieces, cold eyes, hands as wide as her face planted against her chest like stopping a stray cat in the wrong place. Willa didn't stop. She screamed. Her 10-year-old voice shattered down the corridor like breaking glass. The plant on the windowsill is killing the baby. The guards looked at each other, looked at her, looked at each other again. One of them said flatly, without emotion, "Get out. Restricted area." Willa didn't get out. She tried to slip through the gap between them, reached for the door, because she knew behind that door was the oleander, and behind the oleander was the answer, and behind the answer was the life of an 8-month-old baby she had watched in secret every morning for 3 months. She screamed again, louder this time, her voice tearing with desperation. "Oleander. It's Oleander. You have to listen to me." One guard grabbed her by the collar of her jacket, her mother's oversized jacket, and lifted her off the ground like a kitten by the scruff of the neck. Willa's legs kicked in the air. Her hands still reached for the door. She didn't cry. She didn't cry because Dot had taught her that tears were a luxury for people with time. And right now she had no time, because every second passing was a second Nico moved closer to death. She kept shouting, her voice hoarse now but not weaker. "That plant is poison." The sap got on the gardener's gloves. The gloves touched the baby's crib. "You have to take the plant out of the room." Then heavy footsteps thundered from the far end of the corridor, and Willa turned her head and saw Paxton Webb approaching, head of security for the Caruso estate, a former mercenary, a man with a neck as thick as a tree trunk and the eyes of someone who had seen enough to be surprised by nothing. Except right now his eyes were narrowing because he was surprised, because what he saw was a scrawny 10-year-old girl dangling by her collar, screaming about plants like a mad child in the most heavily guarded corridor on the east coast of the United States. Paxton stopped in front of Willa, looked down at her from his full height, and his voice was cold as steel. "Who are you? How did you get in here?" Willa didn't get the chance to answer Paxton because the nursery door burst open and the person who stepped out wasn't a doctor or a nurse, but Emilio Caruso. She had never seen the Caruso boss from this close, never closer than 100 meters. Never anywhere except on the other side of glass, or the other side of a fence, or the other side of the class chasm separating her world from his. But now he was standing right there, less than 2 steps away, and the first thing Willa noticed wasn't wealth or power or the fear everyone talked about, but his eyes. Dark eyes, deep and empty in the way only people who have lost too much can be empty. Yet beneath that emptiness, Willa saw something she recognized instantly, because she had seen it in her mother's eyes every night for 10 years, the fear of losing the only thing left. Emilio looked at the girl dangling by her jacket collar, at the worn heels of her shoes, at the coat 3 sizes too big for her thin body, at eyes red but dry because this child wasn't crying, and he said 2 words to Paxton in a flat voice. The kind people said was most dangerous when it stayed level. "Let her go." Paxton signaled the guards and Willa's feet touched the floor. She swayed for a second, coat askew, hair falling loose, but she didn't step back, didn't lower her head, didn't look down. She looked straight into Emilio Caruso's eyes, and at 10 years old, the daughter of a night housekeeper, standing before the most feared Mafia boss on the east coast of the United States, Willa Mercer spoke. Her voice shook, but each word was clear, the voice of a child trying to cram the knowledge of 4 generations of women into the shortest sentences possible, because she didn't know how many seconds she had before being dragged away. She said, "The plant on the nursery windowsill. It's oleander. Every part of it is poisonous. Someone brought it in 3 days ago. Yesterday the gardener pruned it wearing gloves, and then used those same gloves to wipe the crib rail. The sap got on the rail. The baby touched the rail and then put his hand in his mouth. That's how the poison entered his body. Oleandrin. It causes heart rhythm disturbances, cyanosis, rashes. If it isn't treated correctly, the baby will die." Silence followed, the kind of silence where Willa could hear the ventilator behind the door, and her own heartbeat, and Paxton's heavy breathing behind her like a wall ready to fall at any moment. Then laughter, not from Emilio, but from inside the nursery, where Dr. Whitfield, the Caruso family's private physician, had stepped out and heard everything, and was now laughing, the sharp, dismissive laugh of a man with a medical doctorate from Johns Hopkins and 30 years of experience being told by a 10-year-old girl wearing her mother's coat that he and 23 colleagues were wrong. Dr. Whitfield spoke, polite in tone but with contempt dripping from every syllable. "Mr. Caruso, this is clearly a frightened child saying nonsensical things. Oleander causes poisoning through direct ingestion, not indirect contact like this. We've run all standard toxicology panels and there's no indication of oleander glycosides. I suggest we don't waste any more time." Willa felt her face burn, but she didn't retreat. she said, quieter now but steady. My great-grandmother said oleandrin doesn't show up on standard toxicology screens. It has to be tested for, specifically. You only find it if you know what you're looking for. Dr. Whitfield opened his mouth to continue, but Emilio raised one hand, and the doctor fell silent as if someone had pulled a plug. Emilio looked at Willa, looked for a long time, in a way she had never been looked at in her life. Not glanced over, not looked through, but seen directly, as if he were reading her, weighing every word she had said, searching for any sign of lying or delusion, or anything that would allow him to dismiss her and return to the room where 24 doctors were still failing. He didn't find it. What he found in Willa Mercer's eyes was certainty. The quiet kind no degree teaches. The kind passed down through hands that smelled faintly of lavender, belonging to a woman who had healed half the poorest valley in Appalachia with herbs and faith alone. Emilio turned to Dr. Whitfield, and the doctor saw something in the boss's gaze that made him swallow. Emilio spoke 4 words, flat and leaving no room for argument. Run an oleandrin test. Now. Footsteps came running from the far end of the corridor before Emilio could turn back into the nursery. Not the footsteps of guards or doctors or anyone who belonged on this level of the estate, but the sound of a woman in thin house slippers slapping against marble, the uneven rhythm tangled with ragged breathing, and a sound like the low moan of a wounded animal. Jolene Mercer burst from the service staircase, hair flying loose, her night shift apron still tied around her because she hadn't had time to remove it, when another housekeeper told her that her daughter had broken into a restricted area, that the girl was shouting in front of Mr. Caruso, that Paxton Webb was there, and everyone knew that Paxton Webb's presence meant nothing was small. Jo ran, and the first thing she saw was Willa, her daughter, the only child she had left in the world, standing in the middle of the corridor before a man feared across the entire East Coast, coat hanging crooked, eyes red, posture of a child who had just risked her life without yet knowing how much her life was worth in this world. Jo didn't think. Her body moved before her mind could catch up. The instinct of a mother long used to shielding her child with her own flesh because she had nothing else to shield with. Jo lunged forward, dropped to her knees on the marble floor right in front of Emilio, pulled Willa behind her, wrapped both arms around her daughter and used her own body as a barrier between the child and the boss. And she spoke. "No," she begged, her voice breaking into uneven pieces. Please spare her. She's just a child. She doesn't know anything. I'll pack our things immediately. We'll leave tonight. Please don't hurt my child." Jo's knees hit the cold stone and she felt no pain, because the fear inside her was larger than any pain Bryce Mercer had ever caused, larger than any Appalachian winter without heat, larger than anything she had endured, because this wasn't about her. This was about Willa, and a mother afraid for her child knows no limits to that fear. Willa hid behind her mother's back, and for the first time since she had run into the mansion, her eyes began to fill, not because she feared for herself, but because she saw her mother kneeling, her mother begging, her mother in a position no woman should ever have to take, and she knew she was the one who had pushed her mother there. Emilio stood and watched. For the past year, this woman had worked in his house, mopping the floors he walked on, washing the sheets he slept in, cleaning the dishes he ate from, and he had never known she existed. For 3 years she had moved like smoke through his estate, invisible enough that even the security cameras Paxton checked every day barely caught her shadow. Not because she intended anything, but because the survival instincts of someone used to being hit had taught her that not being seen meant not being hurt. But now Emilio saw her. For the first time, and what he saw wasn't a night housekeeper, not a name on a payroll he had never read, but a mother kneeling on cold stone, shielding her child with her body, willing to accept any punishment, willing to be thrown out into the night, willing to lose everything as long as the child behind her wasn't touched. And something shifted inside Emilio. Not emotion. He had forgotten what emotion was the night Celeste died on Interstate 95, but it was something. A crack, small, thin as a hairline, in the wall of ice he had built around himself for 8 months. The crack began with the image of a woman kneeling at his feet, not because she was weak, but because she was strong enough to make herself small to protect what mattered most. And Emilio recognized it because he was doing the same thing, standing in a room full of doctors feeling more powerless than ever, because his son was dying, and all the power in the world couldn't buy an answer. He looked down at Jo, looked at her hands gripping Willa so tightly her knuckles were white, looked at the faint old bruises on her wrist that he recognized instantly because he had seen enough wounds in his life to know the mark of another person's hand, and Emilio spoke. His voice stayed level, stayed cold, stayed the voice of Caruso that the city feared. But Joe heard something beneath the ice, something she didn't dare name because naming it meant believing in it, and Joe had given up believing in anything a long time ago. Emilio said, "Stand up. No one is going to hurt the child." 30 minutes. 30 minutes passed between the moment Emilio ordered the oleandrin test and the moment the results came back. And during those 30 minutes, Willa sat on the corridor floor outside the nursery, on her mother's lap, silent, eyes open, staring at the closed door behind which 24 doctors were running a test none of them believed would show anything, because none of them believed a 10-year-old housekeeper's daughter could know something they didn't. Joe held Willa and said nothing. She didn't dare speak, because if she opened her mouth she would ask her daughter why she had done this, why she had risked everything. And Joe knew Willa's answer would be something Dot had taught her, something about saving people and doing what was right, and Joe wasn't sure she had the strength to endure her daughter's courage at this moment, because Willa's courage stood in direct opposition to the fear that lived in Joe's bones. Paxton stood guard at the end of the corridor, his eyes never leaving the two of them, not out of suspicion, but because it was his job to watch anything out of place. And a 10-year-old girl screaming about poison plants in front of Mr. Caruso was the most out-of-place thing he had seen in 12 years there. Then the nursery door opened, and Dr. Whitfield stepped out. His face spoke before his mouth did, pale, lips pressed into a hard line. A test report trembled slightly in his hand, a tremor he couldn't hide, because he was too shocked to remember to hide it. He small to Emilio, and said, in the voice of a man whose professional world had just struck him across the face, "Oleandrin positive. Blood levels near cardiac arrest threshold." Silence fell, not the empty kind, but the kind so heavy Willa could feel it pressing on her shoulders. 24 of the world's top doctors. More than 300 years of combined medical experience. Dozens of awards. Hundreds of cited papers. And not one of them had seen what a 10-year-old girl from an Appalachian valley saw at first glance. Dr. Whitfield didn't look at Willa. He couldn't, because looking at her meant admitting that 30 years of Johns Hopkins credentials and experience had just lost to the inherited knowledge of an old Appalachian herbalist, and his professional pride wasn't ready for that admission. It didn't matter anymore. Because inside the nursery everything changed. The medical team immediately shifted protocol. Digoxin-specific antibody fragments administered intravenously, oleandrin detoxification initiated, cardiac monitors recalibrated to read the correct glycoside-induced arrhythmia instead of an unexplained heart failure, as they had for 12 hours. 45 minutes after the antibodies were given, Nico's heart rhythm began to stabilize. An hour later, the rash on his chest stopped spreading. 2 hours later, Nico's skin tone began to change, slowly, in small patches, like dawn, spreading across water, from bruised purple to pale pink, then warm pink, the pink of an 8-month-old baby who was alive, truly alive, no longer dying. Willa looked through the open door and saw Nico's chest rising and falling steadily, saw the tiny hand curl and uncurl, saw lips turning from purple to pink, and she drew in a breath so deep her lungs hurt because she hadn't realized she'd been holding it for 2 hours. Joe saw it too, and understood that her daughter had been right, that the knowledge Dot passed down wasn't superstition or backwardness, but something that had just kept a baby on the living side of the world. Then Emilio stepped out of the nursery for the second time that day, but the man who emerged was not the same man who had stepped out before. Before, he had been the Caruso boss controlling a situation. Now, he was a father who had just watched his son return to life, and the gravity of that moment was pulling him down. Emilio walked to Willa. The entire corridor held its breath. Paxton straightened. Dr. Whitfield looked from the doorway and turned away. And Emilio Caruso, Mafia boss, the man the 5 East Coast families feared, the man who had never knelt before anyone, not even at his father's coffin, lowered one knee onto the cold marble floor before a 10-year-old night housekeeper's daughter. Knee to stone, the sound of expensive trousers brushing marble, his eyes level with Willa's, and he said, his voice hoarse, the voice of a man speaking through a crack in the wall he'd built for 8 months. "You saved my son's life." Willa looked at her mother. Joe nodded faintly, lips trembling, eyes full. Willa looked back at Emilio and spoke softly, with a calm that seemed impossible for a child who had just endured what she had. In the voice Dot would have used if she were still alive, My great-grandmother taught me that if you know how to save someone, and you choose not to, you're no different from the one who harmed them. I only did what she taught me, whether that person ever sees me or not." The last sentence struck Emilio's chest in a place no bullet, no blade, no enemy had ever reached. Whether that person ever sees me or not. The girl had lived 10 years invisible on his estate, skirting walls, learning how not to make noise, and still chose to save his son without needing to be seen, without needing thanks, without needing reward. Emilio stood. He said nothing more, because he wasn't a man of many words. And now he knew even less what to say as the crack in the wall inside his chest spread wider than he wanted to admit. He turned back into the nursery and closed the door, and outside in the corridor, Jo Mercer held her daughter tightly on the cold marble floor and cried, silently, because Jo had learned long ago that crying out loud was a luxury reserved for people allowed to take up space, and she had never been allowed. Emilio didn't sleep that night. He sat in the basement office, the soundproof room no housekeeper was ever allowed near, with a glass of whiskey untouched on the desk and his laptop replaying every second of security footage from the past 3 days. In Emilio Caruso's world there were no accidents, no coincidences, no innocence without someone's hand behind it, and an oleander plant wrapped with a satin ribbon appearing in the nursery of the East Coast Mafia boss's son wasn't a gift, it was a death sentence wrapped in flowers. Emilio rewound the footage to Saturday, 3 days before Nico fell ill, and he saw it clearly. A white, unmarked delivery truck stopping at the side gate at 2:17 in the afternoon, a man in a florist uniform stepping down with the potted plant in his hands, exchanging a few words with the gate guard before being let in, walking straight to the nursery area and placing the plant on the windowsill as if he knew exactly where it belonged. Emilio froze the frame, zoomed in on the deliveryman's face, and called Paxton in. Paxton looked at the screen for less than 5 seconds before saying a name they both knew, Grady. Not a florist. Grady was a former runner in the Caruso network, the kind who handled jobs no one wanted to remember and no one was allowed to talk about, the kind who lived at the lowest tier of the system, took orders, carried them out, vanished, never asking why. But Grady had been cut loose 4 years earlier after skimming money from a Newark port operation, and he should have disappeared completely from Caruso territory unless someone inside the family had kept him close, fed him, and used him for a private purpose. Emilio asked Paxton who Grady had been working for over the past 4 years. Paxton didn't answer right away. He looked at Emilio with the eyes of a man weighing loyalty against caution, then said someone had seen Grady going in and out of Sal's house in Bridgeport at least 3 times over the past 6 months. He hadn't reported it because there was no order to monitor Sal. Salvatore Caruso. Uncle Sal, Giovanni's younger brother, 58 years old, the man who had stood beside Emilio at Giovanni's funeral, placed a hand on Emilio's shoulder and told him he wasn't alone, that his uncle would always be there. The man who had sat in the chair to Emilio's right at every family meeting for 8 years with a loyal face and eyes, Emilio now realized had never been loyal. Emilio ordered Paxton to trace the origin of the plant order. 2 hours later, the results came back. The flower company listed on the delivery invoice was Greenleaf Botanicals, registered in Stamford, Connecticut. Paxton sent people to check and found no such company at the address, only a second-hand shop that had closed last year. The phone number on the invoice was a disposable line, already disconnected. The name of the purchaser was John Davis, a name so common it meant nothing, impossible to trace. Everything was fake. Every trail had been wiped clean by someone who knew exactly how Caruso security worked, who knew the delivery screening procedures, who knew which camera covered which angle and which guard worked which shift, by someone who had lived inside the system long enough to know every weakness. Not an enemy from the outside, an enemy from within. Emilio closed the laptop. He didn't tell Paxton what he was thinking because in the underworld you don't strike until you're certain. You don't let prey know it's been scented. You wait, you watch, you gather until the picture is complete. Then you strike once and only once, because that strike has to be the last. The following afternoon, Salvatore Caruso came to visit Nico. He entered the estate, carrying a bouquet of white flowers and a face full of concern, wrapped Emilio in both arms, patted his back 3 times, and said in a trembling voice everyone assumed was emotion that he hadn't slept after hearing the news. Asking how the boy was and saying he'd come as soon as he could, Emilio returned the embrace and looked past his uncle's shoulder into empty space, his eyes cold as a frozen lake. He said Nico was out of danger. that doctors had discovered oleandrin poisoning from a plant in the nursery, and he watched. He watched Sal's eyes when he heard the words "out of danger," and he saw it. A blink too fast. So fast most people would miss it. But Emilio wasn't most people. Emilio was a man who read others like books. That blink wasn't relief. It was surprise. Surprise that the child was alive. He watched Sal's hands when oleander was mentioned, and he saw it. Sal's left thumb tapped twice against his index finger, a familiar tick that always surfaced when Sal was under stress. A tick Emilio had seen 100 times at poker tables, when Sal held a bad hand. Sal was tense. Not because he feared for Nico, because his plan had failed and he was calculating how much Emilio knew. Emilio knew enough. But not everything. He didn't yet know who Sal was connected to on the outside. Didn't know how wide the network stretched. Didn't know how many pieces were still on the board unseen. So Emilio smiled at his uncle, poured him a glass of wine, thanked him for coming, and walked him to the door with the flawless warmth of a man waiting for the right moment. When Sal's car disappeared beyond the gate, Emilio stood at the window watching and spoke to Paxton behind him without turning around. Monitor every call, every meeting, every step he takes. Around the clock. Don't miss anything. News spread faster than fire through a house full of wind, and within 24 hours after Nico was out of danger, everyone in the estate knew, from the head chef to the gardeners to the night shift security team, that the night housekeeper's daughter had saved the Caruso heir by recognizing what 24 of the world's top doctors had missed. The story was told and retold in the kitchen, in the laundry room, in the security changing area, and each retelling added a new layer of drama, but the core never changed. The 10-year-old girl, Miss Mercer's daughter, knew about oleander because her great-grandmother taught her, and she had risked her life to run into the boss's nursery to say what she knew. Rumors at the Caruso estate never stayed inside the Caruso estate. They slipped out through back doors, through housekeepers calling family, through night guards texting girlfriends, through drivers talking to other drivers while waiting at gas stations, and they reached Salvatore Caruso's ears at his Bridgeport home before Emilio even decided how much Sal should know. Sal sat in his study listening to his people report, and he understood immediately that the board had shifted. The original plan had been clean. Oleander caused slow poisoning, left no trace on standard tests. The baby died. Doctors declared congenital heart failure or sudden infant death syndrome. Emilio collapsed. The main bloodline was cut, and Sal, the closest male relative, would slowly take control of the empire, while Emilio drowned in grief. Now, the baby lived. Doctors knew it was oleandrin. Emilio knew the plant was the cause, and there was a 10-year-old girl and her mother, 2 living witnesses sitting inside the estate, who had seen too much and said too much, and if Emilio started pulling the thread it would lead from the plant to Grady, from Grady to Sal, and from Sal to the Ferrante family across the Hudson River, where Sal had been secretly negotiating for 2 years to divide territory after Emilio fell. Sal needed 2 things: time and silence. Time to erase remaining traces. Silence from the housekeeper and her daughter. On the second night after Nico was out of danger, Jo was washing dishes in the auxiliary kitchen at 11 o'clock at night, her shift running from 10 at night to 6 in the morning as always, because even if her daughter had just saved the boss's son, she was still a housekeeper, and dishes still needed washing, and floors still needed cleaning. She glanced out the kitchen window toward the small house where Willa slept, and saw something that froze her hands midstream. A figure standing in the dark corner behind her house, motionless, watching the window of Willa's room. The figure stood there for about 10 seconds, then melted back into the maple shadows, as if it had never been there. Jo finished the last dish with hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it twice. Ended her shift half an hour early without asking permission. Ran home, locked the door, checked the windows, pulled the curtains, and sat on Willa's bed watching her sleep until dawn. She didn't sleep. She couldn't. Because every time she closed her eyes, she saw that figure standing in exactly the spot where it could see her daughter through the window. The next morning, after Willa left for school, Jo found it. A white envelope, no name, no address, slipped under the front door at some unknown time. Maybe at midnight. Maybe while Jo was running home from the kitchen. She didn't know, and not knowing was more frightening than knowing. Jo opened the envelope with hands shaking so badly she had to grip the paper with both hands. Inside were 2 things. A dried, pressed oleander flower, its petals still faintly yellow, its leaves still shaped exactly like the ones Willa had recognized on the nursery windowsill, and a white slip of paper written in black ink. All capitals. 5 words. You should stay quiet. Jo stared at the dried flower and the note, and felt something collapse inside her. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a small crack like a bone breaking inside her chest. The sound of a woman who had spent her life running from an Appalachian Valley after Bryce, running from Bryce back to Dot, running from Dot to the Caruso estate, and now realizing that the place she thought was safe wasn't safe at all, that nowhere was safe, that being invisible wouldn't save her once someone decided to see her. Jo hid the envelope at the bottom of the wardrobe, picked Willa up from school, cooked dinner, helped with homework, read to her, turned off the light, and when Willa slept, Jo curled around her on the narrow single bed, holding her daughter with both arms as if someone might rip the child from her at any moment. And she shook, from spine to fingertips, shaking not from cold, even though the December night in Connecticut was freezing beyond the glass, but from fear, the most primal fear a mother can feel. Jo didn't sleep that night. At 4 a.m, she decided. She rose, pulled the old suitcase from under the bed, began packing their clothes quietly so Willa wouldn't wake. She didn't know where they would go. She had no money, no family, no place in the world waiting for her, but she had her daughter, and her daughter was threatened, and for a mother that was reason enough to step into the void. She finished packing at 5:30 a.m, woke Willa, dressed her, took her hand, went to the door, opened it, and froze. Paxton Webb stood outside her house with 2 guards behind him, their breath forming white clouds in the cold early morning air, and he looked at the suitcase in Jo's hand, then into her eyes, and said, not as a question but as a statement, "Mr. Caruso wants to see you, right now." Jo had never set foot in the east wing of the main mansion before. For the past year working here, her world had consisted only of the auxiliary kitchen, the laundry room, the servants' corridors, and the small house at the edge of the estate, spaces designed so she could exist, without ever touching anything that belonged to the Caruso family. Now Paxton led her down the main corridor for the first time, where the marble floor reflected her image, as if there were 2 Jolene Mercers walking side by side, one above and one below, both afraid, both gripping their hands until their knuckles turned white. Willa was taken by a guard to the main kitchen for breakfast, and the moment her daughter disappeared from sight was the moment Jo felt as if someone had pulled her spine out of her body. Paxton stopped in front of a heavy oak door, knocked twice, opened it, and stepped aside. Jo went in. Emilio Caruso's office was darker than any room she had ever been in, not because it lacked light, but because everything in it absorbed it. Walls paneled in dark oak, black leather chairs, velvet curtains drawn tight, with only a narrow slit letting the early morning sun cut through the darkness like a blade. The room smelled of whiskey and expensive tobacco and leather and something else Jo couldn't name. Perhaps the scent of power, or danger, or both, because here the 2 were the same. Emilio sat behind his desk, white shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, tie loosened, and for the first time Jo saw the Caruso crest tattooed on his right forearm, a black lion gripping a sword, the ink as sharp as a knife cut in skin. He didn't stand when she entered. He didn't offer her a seat. He only looked at her with the dark eyes Jo had seen in the corridor the day before, eyes that read people like books, and she felt herself being turned page by page. Everything she had hidden, every old bruise, every fear, every sleepless night, laid bare before him, as if she were standing naked in the room, though she was fully dressed. Emilio placed something on the desk and slid it toward her. A white envelope. Jo recognized it instantly and her throat tightened, because it was the same envelope she had hidden at the bottom of her wardrobe less than 2 hours earlier. He already knew, before she did, or at the same time, or perhaps he had been watching her small house even before the shadow appeared. Jo didn't know. And she realized there were too many things here she didn't know, and not knowing made her feel as if she were standing in a minefield in the dark. Emilio spoke flatly. "The security cameras near your house recorded a man arriving at 11:17 last night, slipping the envelope under your door, then leaving toward the west service gate. Where were you planning to go with that suitcase?" Jo swallowed. She looked at the envelope on the desk, at the dried oleander inside, then back at Emilio, and she told the truth because she was too exhausted and too frightened to invent a lie. "I don't know. Anywhere. Just far from here." Silence followed. Emilio studied her for 3 more seconds, then spoke again, And when he did, his voice wasn't asking or offering, it was declaring, the voice of Caruso, issuing an order with no room for the word no. You're not going anywhere. The person who sent this envelope wants my son dead and wants your daughter silent. If you leave, how far do you think you'll get before they find you? You have no money, no place to go, no one to protect you. Out there, you and your daughter are moving targets. In here, you're under my protection. Something flared in Joe's chest. Not gratitude, not relief, but resistance. The resistance of a woman who had already let one man control her life once and sworn it would never happen again, whether that man lived in a broken apartment or a 40-acre mansion. Joe spoke, her voice trembling but not weak. I don't want to be part of your world. I don't want my daughter growing up among bodyguards and guns and threatening envelopes pushed under doors. I just want to live quietly. I just want Willa to be safe. Emilio looked at her, and this time Joe saw something shift in his eyes. Not much, just a thin glimmer, like the crack in the wall of ice she had glimpsed in the corridor when he told her to stand up, and he spoke more slowly, more softly, no longer the voice of a boss giving orders, but the voice of a man stating the simplest truth he knew. You're already part of it, Jolene. From the moment your daughter saved my son's life, they moved that afternoon. Paxton sent 2 guards to the small house at the edge of the estate to help Joe carry their things. But there wasn't much to carry. 1 suitcase, a plastic bag of Willa's clothes, a shoebox holding a few old books, and the only photograph of Dot that Joe still had. And that was everything. The entire life of a mother and daughter reduced to 3 items a guard carried in one hand, without switching grips. The room Emilio gave them was in the west wing on the 2nd floor, close to Nico's nursery, and when Joe opened the door and stepped inside, she had to pause for a moment at the threshold, because the room was larger than the wooden house where she had grown up in Appalachia. A double bed with crisp white sheets, whose fabric Joe recognized immediately, because she had washed those same sheets for 3 years without ever lying on them. A private bathroom with a marble tub and gold-plated fixtures. A walk-in closet standing empty and waiting, so large Willa could stretch out on its floor without touching the walls. Windows overlooking the western gardens where the marble angel fountain poured water endlessly, meaninglessly, day and night. Willa walked a slow circle around the room, fingertips brushing the oak desk, the velvet curtains, the silver-framed mirror, touching everything as if checking whether it was real or just a stage set in a dream she might wake from at any moment. Then she turned back to Joe and said softly, in the voice of a 10-year-old trying to understand a world too large for her, "Mom, it's so beautiful here, but why does everything feel so cold?" Joe didn't know how to answer, because her daughter was right. Everything in that room was expensive, and everything was cold. Cold in the way spaces designed for display rather than living are cold. Cold. In the way the Caruso mansion was always cold, no matter how high the heat ran, because there were kinds of cold no heating system could touch. Joe hugged her daughter and said the only thing she knew to say whenever the world felt too big and she felt too small. "We'll be okay. We always are." But that first night on the wide bed with its white sheets, Joe lay awake staring at the high ceiling and felt like a bird locked inside a golden cage, and the feeling was nauseatingly familiar, because she had been caged before, in Bryce's apartment, in fear, in dependence. And now the cage was prettier, but still a cage, and she wondered whether her whole life was nothing more than moving from one cage to another without ever truly flying. On their second day in the main mansion, Willa did something no one asked for, and no one stopped. She went to the nursery door, stood there looking in, and when the nurse on duty asked what she needed, Willa said she wanted to visit the baby. The nurse looked at the guard radioed Paxton. Paxton asked Emilio, and 15 seconds later, the answer came, "Let her in." Willa entered the nursery for the first time, not through dirty glass from outside, but through the main door, and she walked straight to Nico's crib. The baby was much better, but still fussy, still crying at night, still unable to sleep peacefully despite the rotating team of nurses trying every technique in their manuals. Willa looked at Nico, and Nico looked at Willa, and she began to sing. Not a lullaby from a book. A song Dot had taught her. The song Dot sang to Joe, and Joe sang to Willa, and now Willa sang to Nico. A song about lavender fields on the hills, a stream running through the valley, a woman gathering herbs in the morning mist, a simple melody, plain words, a child's voice slightly off rhythm but warm in a way nothing in the Caruso mansion had ever been. And Nico stopped crying. The baby gazed at Willa with wide eyes, tiny hands reaching as if to touch the sound, and slowly, slowly, his eyes closed, his breathing evened, his chest rose and fell gently, asleep. The nurse on duty stared at Willa with her mouth slightly open, because she had spent the entire previous night trying to soothe Nico without success, and a 10-year-old girl had just done in 3 minutes what she couldn't do in 8 hours. From then on, Willa came to the nursery every day. In the morning before school, in the afternoon after returning, at night before bed. She sang to Nico, whispered to him about plants, held his hand when he fussed, and Nico was only truly calm when Willa was near, as if by some instinct he recognized that this girl was the one who had pulled him back from the edge, that this voice was the first he heard after surviving, and it became his anchor in a world too large and too cold. Jo stood at the nursery door watching her daughter sing to the son of a Mafia boss, watching 2 children whose circumstances should never have allowed them to touch now lying close together, one singing and one listening, and Jo smiled, for the first time in a very long time. She couldn't remember the last time she had smiled. Maybe when Dot was still alive, maybe before Bryce, maybe in another lifetime. But now, she stood at the threshold between 2 worlds, the world of marble and crystal ahead, and the world of servants' corridors behind, and she smiled because her daughter was doing the thing Dot always said mattered most in life: healing, not with medicine or money, but with presence, with being there when someone needs you, with seeing the child inside a person the world only sees as power and wealth. The first time it happened was on the 4th night after the 2 of them moved into the main mansion. Jo couldn't sleep. She rarely could, because the past year of night shifts had wrecked her internal clock so thoroughly that her body was now most awake at 2 in the morning, and she went down to the kitchen to make a cup of coffee, because coffee was the only reward she knew how to give herself without spending money, since the mansion kitchen always had coffee. She was standing by the counter, cradling the mug, eyes fixed on the dark garden beyond the window, when she heard footsteps. Not the footsteps of guards, because guards walked with machine-like rhythm, but slow, heavy steps, the steps of someone walking without a destination. And when Jo turned, Emilio Caruso was standing in the kitchen doorway, white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, an empty glass in his hand, and they looked at each other for about 3 seconds, 3 seconds longer than any conversation they had ever had. Emilio said nothing. He walked to the liquor cabinet, poured whiskey, then stood at the counter less than a meter from Jo, drank, looked out the same window she was looking through, and stayed silent. Jo drank coffee. Emilio drank whiskey. No one spoke a word. After 15 minutes, Emilio set the glass down and left, and Jo stayed 5 minutes longer listening to her heart beat faster than usual, without knowing why. The next night, same hour, same kitchen, same coffee and whiskey, same silence. But this time before leaving, Emilio spoke, not looking at her, eyes still on the window, asking what song the girl sang to Nico. Jo was so startled she nearly dropped the mug and answered that it was the song her great-grandmother taught her, about the lavender fields. Emilio nodded once and left. 4 words and 1 answer. That was all. But it was more than 3 years of silence before, and Jo felt something shift gently inside her, so faint she almost missed it, like the surface of a lake rippling from a pebble dropped far away. The nights that followed, the conversations grew longer by single sentences, 1 sentence at a time, slow and careful, like 2 people walking on thin ice knowing deep water waited below. Emilio asked about Dot, not politely, but specifically, like someone who genuinely wanted to understand, how she taught Willa to recognize plants, where the knowledge came from, how many people she treated, whether she ever wrote anything down. Jo told him, briefly at first, then longer still, because no one had asked about Dot in a long time, and when someone finally did, the memories spilled out like water through a broken dam. She spoke of the night Dot delivered Willa in the snow, of hands that smelled of lavender, of the way Dot bent over a sick plant and knew its illness before the leaves even wilted. Emilio listened. He listened with the absolute focus of a man used to analyzing information, but Jo sensed something beneath that focus, something like respect or genuine curiosity, or perhaps simply the loneliness of a man who had no one to talk to at 2 in the morning except a glass of whiskey. Then one night Jo asked about Celeste. She hadn't meant to. The question slipped out before her mind could stop it. Perhaps because it was 3 in the morning, and 3 in the morning blurred the line between what should and shouldn't be said. She asked what she was like, Just 3 words. Emilio didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his whiskey, slowly turning the glass, and Joe thought she had gone too far, touched something forbidden, and she was about to apologize when Emilio said that she was the only person who wasn't afraid of him. Silence followed. Then he added, more quietly, that he couldn't keep her. He said nothing more, and Joe didn't ask, because she understood that those 6 words were more than Emilio Caruso had said to anyone about Celeste since the night on Interstate 95, and she didn't want to break that moment with unnecessary speech. They stood in the dark kitchen less than a meter apart, not touching, but the air between them was thick like the moment before a storm, heavy and warm and full of something unnamed, and Joe felt it on her skin, on her wrists, at the back of her neck, a sensation she hadn't felt since before Bryce, before intimacy had been turned into a weapon. And feeling it now, here, with this man, frightened her and made her angry at herself at the same time. Then came the 12th night. Joe was passing the small study beside the master bedroom on her way back to her room from the kitchen, the door slightly open, and she glanced in by reflex, just a 1/10 of a second, but it was enough. Emilio was changing, his back to the door, and Joe saw it. Not the crest tattoo on his forearm she had seen in his office, but his back, a map of violence carved into flesh, a long scar slashing diagonally from left shoulder blade to lower back, pale and puckered, the mark of a knife or something sharper, 2 small round scars on his right side, clean and precise, old bullet wounds healed but never gone, and others she didn't have time to count because she turned away, quickly, walked on, but not quickly enough. In the mirror on the study wall, Emilio had seen her. Their eyes met through the glass, through reflection, not directly, as if both needed that thin barrier so the look wouldn't burn something they were both pretending didn't exist. Joe didn't stop. Emilio didn't call out. No one spoke, but when Joe reached her room, closed the door, leaned against the wood, she shut her eyes and saw the scars on his back printed on the inside of her lids like a negative image, and she understood that a boundary had shifted, that something had changed that night that couldn't be undone, that she had seen the most vulnerable part of a man who never let anyone see him vulnerable, and that it bound her to him with a thread she didn't want and couldn't cut. But the Caruso mansion wasn't made up only of quiet nights in the kitchen with coffee and whiskey and conversations that made Joe forget where she was. The Caruso mansion had another face, and that face began to reveal itself piece by piece, like beautiful paint peeling away to expose the rotting wall beneath. The first time was the phone call. 2 a.m, Joe was heading down to the kitchen as she did every night, and she heard Emilio's voice echoing from the soundproof office in the basement. The door left ajar that night because someone had forgotten to close it. She couldn't make out the words, only the rhythm, and that rhythm wasn't the rhythm of the man who asked her about Dot or told her that Celeste was the only person who wasn't afraid of him. This rhythm was short, sharp, cold, every sentence like a bullet. And even though Joe didn't understand the content, she understood the tone. She understood because she had heard that tone in Bryce before he hit her. The tone of a man who was controlling violence rather than restraining it. And the difference between those 2 things was as thin as a blade. Joe turned back toward the kitchen and didn't go down to the basement. The second time was the blood. One early morning, Joe woke earlier than usual because Willa had kicked off her blanket in her sleep, and she stepped into the hallway just as Emilio came up from the eastern stairwell, the one that led up from the basement. He passed her, nodded slightly as always, but Joe saw it. A dark red smear on the right cuff of his white shirt, no bigger than a coin, but red in a way that couldn't be mistaken for anything but blood. Emilio realized she had seen it. He lowered his arm and pulled the cuff forward with a motion so natural it was almost unconscious. The motion of someone used to hiding bloodstains on their sleeves, and walked on without a word. Joe stood in the hallway watching him go, and she remembered how she used to pull long sleeves down over Bryce's bruises with that same instinctive motion, and the similarity made her nauseous. The third time was the sound. The sound came from the basement on a Thursday night, when Joe took a wrong turn in the hallway, because the mansion was so large, and she still wasn't used to navigating it at midnight. She turned right instead of left, and found herself in front of the soundproof door leading down to the basement, a door that should have been sealed shut, but that night was cracked open because someone had just passed through and hadn't closed it yet. And through that crack, Joe heard it. Not screaming. Worse than screaming. The sound of a man trying to speak through pain, broken, muffled noises, ragged breathing, a chair scraping across concrete, and beneath it all, Emilio's voice, calm, even, asking something Joe couldn't hear clearly, but knew wasn't a polite question. Joe backed away, quickly, silently, guided by the invisible instinct her mother had drilled into her bones since childhood, and she turned and walked fast back to her room, closed the door, sat on the bed, wrapped her arms around her knees, and breathed and tried not to think about what she had just heard. But she couldn't not think, because 20 minutes later, she heard Emilio's footsteps passing her room in the hallway, slow and steady. The footsteps of a man who had finished his work, and she looked through the crack of the door, just a sliver, just enough to see him pass, and she saw his eyes. Emilio's eyes at 3 a.m. after coming up from the basement weren't the eyes that had looked at her through the mirror the night before with something soft and vulnerable beneath the ice. These eyes were cold, empty, completely black, like two bottomless wells where anyone who looked would see nothing but darkness. The eyes of a man who had just done something ordinary people couldn't do, and felt nothing afterward. And that lack of feeling was the most frightening thing of all, more frightening than Bryce's rage, because Bryce hurt her when he lost control, while Emilio did what he had just done in a state of absolute control. Joe closed the door, lay down beside Willa, and watched her daughter sleep. And in the darkness of the luxurious room, with white sheets and velvet curtains, she faced the truth she had been avoiding for 2 weeks. She had feelings for Emilio Caruso. Not gratitude, not fear, but something in between, something hot and dangerous and that shouldn't exist, something that began the night he told her to stand up, and grew with every night in the kitchen, and flared when she saw the scars on his back in the mirror. She had feelings for a killer, for a man who had just interrogated someone in the basement and emerged with blood on his cuff and empty eyes. Joe lay in the dark and felt disgust for herself. Disgust that she had escaped one violent man only to feel drawn to a man 100 times more dangerous. Disgust that she wondered whether something inside her was broken, something Bryce had shattered that no one could fix. Something that pulled her toward darkness the way a moth is pulled toward flame. She held Willa tighter and whispered into her daughter's hair in a voice only she could hear that they would be fine, that they were always fine. But this time, for the first time, she didn't believe it. Sal lost patience. 2 weeks of watching Emilio had given him no new information beyond a truth so obvious it didn't need confirmation. Emilio was suspicious. Emilio was waiting. And when Emilio Caruso waited, the one being waited on never ended well. Sal knew how his nephew operated. Knew because he had stood beside Giovanni when Giovanni taught Emilio everything. Knew that Emilio never struck without enough proof. But once he had it, he moved so fast the prey didn't even understand what was happening. Sal needed to act before the noose tightened. He needed 2 things: time to erase every trace connecting him to the Ferrante family, and permanent silence from the 10-year-old girl who had ruined his perfect plan with her knowledge of a single plant. Grady received the order on a Wednesday morning through a disposable phone, the call lasting less than 40 seconds, just long enough to hear 2 sentences. The girl got off the school bus at a stop half a kilometer from the estate at 3:15 every afternoon. She had 1 escort from the stop to the house, cut the escort's radio and handle it, keep the girl alive, do nothing else until further orders. At 3:14 that Wednesday afternoon, Willa stepped off the school bus at the stop on County Road 7, backpack on her shoulders, hair in a ponytail, new shoes on her feet that Emilio had quietly had someone buy for her after noticing the worn heels on her old ones, shoes that appeared outside the room she shared with her mother the next day without explanation. The escort stood 10 meters away, lifting a hand to his earpiece to confirm position with Central Security as he did every day, and there was no signal. He tried again. Nothing. The frequency was jammed, completely and cleanly, by the jammer Grady had placed in the black truck parked 30 meters away. A truck with no logo and no plates, identical to thousands of delivery trucks that drove Connecticut roads every day. The escort turned to look for Willa, and in the moment he turned. 2 seconds. Only 2 seconds. The truck slid up to the curb. The side door opened. An arm pulled Willa into the darkness inside. The door slammed shut. The truck rolled forward, and County Road 7 lay empty as if nothing had happened. Willa didn't have time to scream. Her backpack fell on the sidewalk, the zipper splitting open, textbooks spilling out, a notebook page fluttering in the wind on the asphalt. The escort saw the backpack before he saw the truck disappear around the bend, and he ran to the backpack, looked around, understood, and using his personal phone because his radio was dead, he called Paxton. Paxton called Emilio. Emilio was in the nursery with Nico, standing beside the crib watching his son sleep, what he did every afternoon at 3 when there were no meetings, and when he heard Paxton speak, the hand resting on the crib rail tightened until the wood creaked. He didn't ask again. Didn't ask if they were sure or how. He set the phone down, looked at Nico for 3 more seconds, then walked out of the nursery and became the thing the entire East Coast had feared for 8 years. Don Caruso. No mask, no padding, no nights in the kitchen with whiskey and stories about a dead woman. Just the cold, precise, brutal machine running at full capacity. Emilio called Paxton into his office, and in 15 minutes, he activated the entire Caruso network. Every one of his people on every street in Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey moved. Every contact in the police, the ports, the airports, the bus terminals was woken up. Every route out of Greenwich was watched. Emilio Caruso didn't lock down a city with law. He locked it down with something more effective than law: fear. Within an hour, not a single unfamiliar vehicle could move within a 50-kilometer radius of Greenwich without at least 3 pairs of eyes on it. Then Joe knew. She was in the laundry room, still working because even living in a luxurious wing, she still washed clothes since no one had told her to stop, and she didn't know who she was if she wasn't a maid. When Paxton appeared in the doorway and said 3 words, Willa was taken, Joe didn't scream right away. She stood frozen for about 4 seconds. 4 seconds in which she was still on the outside, while everything inside collapsed at once like a building stripped of its supports. Then she crumpled to the laundry room floor, knees hitting tile, hands bracing against the ground, and the sound that tore from her throat wasn't a scream but a howl, the cry of a mother animal ripped from her child, raw and primal, and shredding every layer of invisibility she had built over 29 years. She slammed her hands against the floor, struck her head against the edge of the washer, screamed Willa's name, and Paxton had to restrain her because she was about to hurt herself. Holding a woman thrashing with the strength of pure desperation, the kind of strength ordinary muscles don't have but fear of losing a child can create. Emilio heard Joe's cries from 2 floors above and stopped mid-sentence while speaking to Paxton on the phone. Paused for a single beat, just one. But Paxton on the other end heard that silence and understood that the scream from the woman below had touched something inside the Don that Paxton thought had died on Interstate 95. Emilio continued, his voice unchanged, the orders unchanged. But something beneath that voice had shifted. Something boiling and black, and more dangerous than his usual cold calculation, because this time it wasn't only strategy. This time there was rage, something Emilio Caruso almost never allowed himself to feel because rage led to mistakes. But this time he couldn't restrain it, because a 10-year-old innocent girl was somewhere out there in the hands of someone he was beginning to know. Emilio called Sal. The phone rang 3 times. Sal picked up. Emilio spoke in a tone so normal it could have been a routine check-in. Uncle Sal, I'm calling because something happened. The maid's daughter was kidnapped on her way home from school. Have you heard anything? And Sal answered, his voice calm. Too calm. Calm in a way a 58-year-old man hearing that a 10-year-old child in his nephew's household had been taken shouldn't be calm. Calm in a way a normal man would have fired questions, would have been shocked, would have shown worry. But Sal only said, My God, that's terrible. Do you need my help with anything? No sharp intake of breath, no chair scraping as he stood abruptly, no surprise in a single syllable. And Emilio knew. He had suspected it since the oleander, had nearly been sure after Grady on the camera, had watched for 2 weeks. But now he knew with the instinct his father taught him never failed. When a man hears bad news and isn't surprised, it means he already knew. And if he already knew, he was part of the bad news. Emilio thanked his uncle, said he'd handle it, and hung up. He set the phone down gently on the desk and stared into the empty space ahead of him with eyes that, if Sal could see them now, would have sent him running far away and never looking back. It took Paxton 3 hours and 42 minutes to find Willa. 3 hours and 42 minutes, in which Joe died once and came back to life once every minute, because she couldn't truly die while her daughter was still out there. Paxton used everything he had. The traffic camera network the Caruso people had hacked long ago, automatic toll data from every highway station within a 50-kilometer radius, the eyes and ears of hundreds of people on the streets the Caruso family had cultivated for decades. From the hot dog vendor on the corner, to taxi drivers, to parking attendants at every port along the Connecticut coast. The black truck was spotted on toll cameras on Interstate 95 southbound at 3:47 in the afternoon, lost at the Bridgeport Junction, reappeared on a gas station security camera in the outskirts of Stratford at 4:23, then vanished into the Stratford Port Industrial Zone to the south, where dozens of abandoned warehouses lined the Housatonic River, a place where undeclared goods had passed through since the days of Giovanni Caruso. Paxton narrowed it down to 3 warehouses, based on the truck's last direction, and a contact at the port confirmed there were lights on in warehouse number 7. A building closed for 2 years, with a black truck parked inside. Paxton notified Emilio. Emilio stood up, took his jacket, and Paxton didn't need to ask whether the boss was going personally, because the answer was already there in the way Emilio checked the handgun tucked into the small of his back and walked out without looking behind him. 3 black SUVs lined up at the main gate, engines running, lights off, each carrying 4 men Joe didn't want to know the names of and didn't want to know how they made their living. Emilio stepped toward the first vehicle when Joe stopped him. She stood in the driveway, eyes swollen and red, hair disheveled, still wearing her laundry clothes because she hadn't changed since hearing the news, and she said, "I'm going." Emilio looked at her, and in any other circumstance, he would have said no, because this wasn't a place for a woman who didn't know how to hold a gun and knew nothing about how the Caruso network moved when it switched to war mode. He said, "You stay here. It isn't safe." Joe didn't move. She looked at him with eyes Emilio had never seen on her face before. Not the eyes of the woman kneeling and begging in the corridor. Not the eyes of an invisible maid. Not the eyes of fear, but the eyes of a mother whose child was being held somewhere in the dark. And everything in the world, including a mafia boss, including guns, including death, carried no weight against her standing between him and her daughter. Joe said, her voice steady. For the first time since she had set foot on the Caruso estate, her voice didn't shake. "That's my daughter. You could shoot me and you still wouldn't stop me." Emilio studied her for 2 more seconds. Then he opened the car door and nodded. Joe got in. The convoy moved through the darkness with no lights. 3 black SUVs on Interstate 95 southbound, like 3 hunting beasts. Fast, silent, precise. Joe sat in the back seat beside Emilio and realized for the first time that she was sitting close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, that she could smell whiskey and leather and gunpowder on his jacket, and she wasn't afraid anymore. Not of anything, because the worst fear had already happened. And once the worst has happened, there's nothing left to fear. 28 minutes later, the convoy cut its engines 200 meters from warehouse number 7. Paxton deployed his men. 4 to the front entrance, 4 to the rear, 4 to secure the perimeter. Emilio told Joe, "You stay in the car until I come back." This time Joe nodded because she understood the difference between being held back and being kept safe. What happened inside warehouse number 7 lasted less than 4 minutes. Joe sat in the car and listened. The sound of a metal door being forced open. A short shout. Gunfire. 2 shots, clean and sharp, echoing in the empty space, and then cutting off. The sound of a heavy body hitting concrete. Then silence. The silence lasted maybe 30 seconds, but to Joe it felt like 30 years. Then the radio crackled, and Paxton's voice said 2 words, "Secure." Joe opened the car door and ran. She ran across the cracked concrete lot, through the torn open metal door, into the dark warehouse lit only by sweeping flashlights. She ran past something lying on the floor she didn't look down at, and didn't want to look down at because she knew it was Grady, or what was left of Grady. And she ran toward the cluster of light in the corner, where a small door led into an inner room. Willa sat on the cold concrete floor, hands bound with plastic zip ties, hair loose, a tear in her shirt at the shoulder. But her eyes were open, dry, and when she saw Emilio enter first, gun still in his hand, face dark in the flashlight beam, she didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't shrink away. Willa looked at Emilio and said in a hoarse voice from dryness, but steady enough that the 4 guards around her all turned to look at the child, "I knew you'd come. My mom says you're a man who keeps his word." Emilio cut the zip ties on Willa's wrists with the folding knife he pulled from his pocket, gently, carefully, in a way that didn't match the hand that had pulled a trigger less than 2 minutes earlier, and at that moment Joe burst into the room. She saw Willa and her legs gave out. She collapsed onto the concrete in front of her daughter, knees hitting the cold floor for the second time because of Willa, but this time not in pleading. This time because her body no longer had the strength to stand when everything she feared losing was right there in front of her. Alive, breathing, looking at her with Dot's eyes. Joe held Willa, held her with both arms and her whole body, held her on the freezing concrete floor of an abandoned warehouse at the Stratford port, and she cried without sound. Because Joe always cried without sound, but her shoulders shook and tears soaked into Willa's hair, and Willa held her mother back with arms still marked red from the zip ties and whispered, "I'm okay, Mom. I'm okay." Emilio stood watching. He stood 3 steps away, gun back at his waist, arms at his sides, and he watched the woman holding her daughter on the concrete floor, and he remembered. He remembered the night on Interstate 95, remembered holding Celeste's hand in the ambulance while doctors cut Nico from her body, remembered Nico's first cry, and the heart monitor flattening into a straight line, remembered that he hadn't been in time, that he hadn't saved her, that he'd arrived too late, and since then he'd sworn he would never be late again for anyone he cared about. And now he stood in the warehouse watching a mother and child hold each other on the concrete, and he knew that he cared. That the wall he had built for 8 months since the night Celeste died, the wall of ice whose first crack had begun when Joe knelt in the corridor, and whose second crack came the night he spoke of Celeste in the kitchen, and whose third crack came from Joe's eyes meeting his through the mirror, that wall was no longer cracked. It collapsed, completely, silently, inside his chest. And Emilio Caruso stood amid the ruins of himself, looking at the mother and child on the concrete floor, and for the first time in 8 months, he felt something other than rage and emptiness. He felt. 2 days later, Emilio invited Sal to dinner at the mansion. The invitation was delivered by phone in the warmest voice Emilio could summon. The voice of a nephew inviting his uncle to a family meal. Nothing more. And Sal accepted immediately because refusing an invitation from Emilio Caruso was something no one did, even knowing the dinner might be the last. The main dining room was set to perfection. A long oak table built for 16, but tonight holding only 2 chairs facing each other at opposite ends. White candles burning in silver holders. A bottle of red Barolo, from the 97 vintage, that Giovanni had kept in the cellar for special occasions. Porcelain plates with gold rims. Polished silver knives reflecting the candlelight like mirrors. Everything was beautiful to the point of dread, beautiful in the way only final dinners are. When the one who sets the table knows the purpose of the meal, and the one who sits down does not. Sal arrived at 7 in the evening. Gray suit, dark blue tie, expensive cologne, the smile of a loving uncle visiting his nephew. He entered the dining room, looked at the table, the candles, the 97 Barolo, and if he sensed anything amiss, he hid it well, because his face showed only the pleasure of a man about to drink fine wine. Uncle and nephew took their seats. The chef served the appetizer. Sal praised it. Emilio nodded in thanks. They spoke about the weather, about rising coastal real estate prices, about last night's game, and the conversation flowed so normally that anyone listening would think this was simply 2 family men enjoying a quiet dinner. The main course was served. Sal cut his first piece of veal, and Emilio placed 3 things on the table, right between their plates. First, a dried oleander flower, identical to the one in the threatening envelope someone had slipped under Joe's door, the petals slightly yellowed, the leaves still holding the shape Willa had recognized on the nursery windowsill. Second, a still image printed from a Stratford gas station security camera, showing Grady receiving a thick envelope from a man whose face was slightly blurred, but whose signet ring on the little finger of his left hand was perfectly clear, the ring Giovanni had given Sal on his 60th birthday. The ring Sal was wearing at this very moment, on the little finger of the hand holding the knife, cutting the veal. Third, a small phone with its screen lit, playing an audio recording of a call between Sal and a man Paxton had identified as Tommaso Ferrante, head of the Ferrante family across the Hudson, a call in which Sal discussed dividing the East Coast territory after the kid loses his son and collapses. Just a matter of time. The knife in Sal's hand stopped. He looked at the flower, the photograph, the phone playing his own voice, and the color drained from his face as if a valve had been opened, from ruddy to pale to chalk white, in 3 seconds. He looked up at Emilio and saw the black eyes staring back from the far end of the table. Eyes without anger, without sorrow, without disgust. Only empty, empty in the way a death sentence is empty, because it needs no emotion, only a signature. Sal set the knife down. His hands trembled and he could no longer hide it. He opened his mouth, and what spilled out was a jumble of denial and pleading. Emilio, listen to your uncle. This isn't what you think. I was forced. Ferrante forced me. I had no choice. You have to understand. I'm your father's brother. Blood is blood. Giovanni wouldn't want this. Emilio raised one hand, and Sal fell silent mid-sentence, as if someone had muted him. Emilio spoke, his voice flat, each word dropping onto the table like a stone. You wanted to kill my son. You poisoned an 8-month-old baby with a ribbon-wrapped plant. When it didn't work, you ordered the kidnapping of an innocent 10-year-old girl to silence her. In our world, you know the punishment for that. Blood doesn't change the sentence. It only makes the crime worse. Sal opened his mouth again, but no sound came out, because he saw Paxton enter the dining room through the rear service door with 2 other men, and he understood the dinner was over. Emilio stood, took his napkin, wiped his mouth, set the napkin down beside the untouched plate, and walked out of the dining room without looking back. He didn't need to look back. Sal's voice followed him, first calling his name, then begging, then screaming, echoing through the high-ceilinged dining room with its white candles and the half-full bottle of 97 Barolo. Then the service door closed, and the screams cut off as if a coffin lid had been shut. Salvatore Caruso was never seen again. Not at the mansion, not in the city, not in any database the police could access. He vanished completely and absolutely in the way only those who anger the Caruso family vanish. And no one asked, no one searched, because in this world there are questions whose answers are more dangerous than not knowing, and everyone is wise enough not to ask. The night after Sal disappeared, the Caruso mansion fell silent in the way a house goes silent after something has been cut out of it. Not peaceful, but hollow, like a body after surgery when the incision hasn't been stitched yet. The staff moved more lightly than usual. The guards stared more straight ahead than usual. No one spoke Sal's name, and the absence of that name was louder than any scream. Willa fell asleep at 9 in the evening, sleeping deeply, sleeping with the sleep of a child who had lived through something no child should ever live through, yet still believed the world would be okay, because her mother said so, and the boss had kept his word. Jo tucked the blanket around her daughter, kissed Willa's forehead, closed the door gently, and walked down the hall. Not toward the kitchen, not to look for coffee. She walked toward Emilio's office because she knew he was there, because he was always there at this hour, because the nights in the kitchen had taught her his sleepless schedule as precisely as her own. The office door was slightly ajar, weak yellow lamplight spilling into the hallway, and Jo pushed the door open without knocking. The second time she had entered this room, the first time summoned, this time coming on her own, and the difference between those 2 moments was greater than she had imagined. Emilio sat behind the desk, whiskey in his hand, the glass nearly full, meaning he had just poured it and hadn't yet drunk, his white shirt unbuttoned at the top 2 buttons, his eyes fixed on nothing ahead. And when Jo stepped inside, he didn't look startled or glance up sharply. He only shifted his gaze to her slowly, as if he had known she would come, or had hoped she would come, or had feared she would come, and perhaps all 3 at once. Jo stood in the middle of the room, 3 steps from the desk, and she spoke. No preamble. No soft beginning. She had spent the entire night lying beside Willa preparing for this moment, and she wasn't going to waste it on unnecessary words. She said, I know what you just did to Sal. Emilio didn't deny it. He didn't explain. He didn't justify. He looked at her with eyes she had seen in many versions over the past weeks. The boss's eyes, the father's eyes, the killer's eyes, the lonely man's eyes at 3 in the morning, and tonight there was a version she had never seen before. The eyes of a man waiting to be judged by the only person whose judgment mattered to him. Jo continued, I should be afraid of you. Everything in my head, everything I learned from Bryce, from years of being beaten, from running, all of it says I should take Willa and go as far away from you as possible, that you're dangerous, that your world would swallow us whole. She paused, took a breath, and what came out next wasn't what her reason allowed, but what everything else in her demanded. But I don't want to run anymore. I've been running my whole life. Silence followed. The kind of silence that was heavy and dense and hot, like the air before a storm. The same feeling she had sensed in the kitchen night after night, but now 10 times stronger because there was no counter between them, no coffee cup or whiskey glass as a barrier, nothing but 3 steps and the truth. Emilio set the whiskey glass down on the desk slowly and stood. He walked around the desk and stopped in front of Jo, closer than they had ever stood, close enough that she could see the pulse beating in his neck, close enough that she could count the strands of prematurely gray hair at his temples that at 36 shouldn't yet be there. But Emilio Caruso's life had never been a life of should. He spoke, and his voice was hoarse in a way Jo had never heard. the voice of a man saying something he believed to be true, even though that truth ran against what he wanted. "I don't deserve you, Jolene. You know who I am. You know what I do. You know what's in the basement. You deserve something far better than a man like me." Joe looked up into his eyes and she saw it. The crack. Not the small crack from the hallway that first day. The wall had already fallen, collapsed in that warehouse at the Stratford port when he had watched her hold Willa on the concrete floor. And what lay behind that wall was now looking at her, raw and exposed and aching. And Joe realized that Emilio Caruso was afraid, not afraid of enemies or bullets or death, but afraid of her, afraid she would see the truest part of him and turn away, afraid he would lose one more person. And that fear was painfully similar to the fear Joe saw in the mirror every morning for the past year. Joe spoke softly, softer than any words she had spoken to anyone since Dot died. "Willa trusts you. She saw you walk into that dark warehouse and she wasn't afraid. She said she knew you'd come, 10 years old, tied up in the dark, and she trusted you." She paused. "And I trust my daughter." Emilio looked at her and she looked at him, and the 3 steps between them shrank to 2, then to 1, then to nothing. He lifted his hand slowly, so slowly that Joe could have stepped back if she wanted, slowly enough that it was clear he was giving her the choice, and he placed his fingertips under her chin, lifting her face, gentle, so gentle that Joe nearly cried because she had forgotten that a man's hands could be gentle. Bryce had taken that memory from her, and Emilio was giving it back with his fingertips beneath her chin. Their first kiss didn't ignite. It was slow and aching and careful, almost hesitant, like 2 wounded people touching each other's scars and trying not to hurt one another more. His lips against hers, and Joe felt everything at once, whiskey and salt and pain and something warm whose name she had forgotten, and she placed her hand on his chest, not to push him away, but to feel the heartbeat beneath. Faster than normal, the heartbeat of the Caruso boss trembling from a kiss, and the contrast between the man who killed without blinking and the man trembling because her lips touched his shattered Joe completely, breaking down every wall she had built, every vow never to let a man close again, every fear, and she realized she wasn't kissing him despite his danger. She was kissing him because beneath that danger, she saw the same thing she saw in the mirror, someone beaten raw by the world and still trying to stand. When they pulled apart, foreheads touching, breaths mingling, Joe whispered, "Don't give me another reason to run." Emilio answered, his voice so hoarse it was almost inaudible, "Never." 6 months later, on a blazing June morning in the Appalachian Valley, Jolene Mercer stood before a building that 6 months earlier had been an empty lot where Dot had once grown lavender, and she couldn't believe her eyes. The Dorothy Harlan Community Medical Center. The name was carved into a granite stone sign at the main entrance, bronze letters gleaming in the sun, and every time Joe looked at that name her eyes burned, because Dot had spent her entire life treating the valley's poor with herbs in her hands, never charging money, never being acknowledged. And now her name sat on the facade of a 3-story medical center, with modern clinics, laboratories, an emergency wing, a pharmacy, and a separate wing devoted to herbal medical research that, when Emilio asked Joe what she wanted to name it, she answered without thinking, the Willa Wing. Emilio hadn't built the center to atone, or to launder money, or for any reason the outside world might assign when a Mafia boss poured funds into a charitable project in a remote place. He built it because one night in the mansion kitchen, at 3 o'clock in the morning, Joe told him about Dot, about the night she delivered Willa in the snow, about how she bent to smell leaves and knew illness before symptoms appeared, and he asked, "What do you want most in the world?" And Joe answered without hesitation, "I want what my grandmother knew, not to die with her." 2 weeks later, an architect from New York arrived in the valley to survey the land. The Dorothy Harlan Center was built in 5 months, twice as fast as normal, because when Emilio Caruso wanted something finished, it finished, and the opening ceremony was set for Dot's birthday, June 7th, the day every year Joe lit a candle at Dot's grave on the hill behind the house and spoke to her as if she could still hear. The ceremony wasn't large by the world's standards, but it was large by the valley's. Nearly 200 people sat in the main hall, wooden chairs lined in rows, ceiling fans turning slowly, sunlight pouring through tall windows overlooking the fields where Dot had once gathered medicine, and most of those 200 were valley folk. Faces Joe recognized from childhood, people Dot had treated, people who had brought sweet potatoes and pumpkins in thanks because no one had money to pay, and now they sat in a building bearing her name with wet eyes and wide smiles. Joe sat in the front row beside Emilio and looked down at her hand resting on her lap, the hand that had scrubbed marble floors in the Caruso mansion, washed dishes at midnight, hidden bruises beneath long sleeves, now holding Emilio's hand before 200 people, without hiding, without needing to hide, because she was no longer invisible. Joe had been appointed director of the center's herbal medicine program, a position she would have laughed at 6 months earlier if anyone had said she was qualified. But Emilio hired a medical advisor from Yale University to train her for 4 months, and Joe learned quickly, because the knowledge had already lived in her from 15 years beside Dot. She only needed scientific language to name what Dot had taught her in the Valley's tongue. Willa received a full scholarship to Greenwich Academy, Connecticut's leading private school, awarded for excellence in natural sciences, and when the homeroom teacher called Joe to tell her, she said, "Your daughter has a knowledge of botany that even third-year university students often don't have. I've never met a student like her." And Joe hung up and cried in the bathroom for 15 minutes, then came out and smiled at Willa as if nothing had happened. Now, at the opening ceremony, Willa stood on the small stage before 200 people and spoke. 10 years old, hair neatly tied back, wearing a new white dress, standing at the microphone without trembling, and Joe wondered where her daughter found that courage, before remembering that the girl had once stood before the most feared Mafia boss on the East Coast and explained oleander without shaking. So 200 Appalachian farmers were nothing, Willa said, her voice small but clear, carried to every corner of the hall by the microphone. "My great-grandmother taught me that everything that heals grows from the earth, and everyone who heals grows from love. My great-grandmother had no degrees. She had no money, but she had her hands, and she had patience, and she had knowledge passed down from her great-grandmother, and with that she saved more people than I can count. This center bears her name not because she was famous, but because she deserved to be seen. I want to say thank you to my great-grandmother, and I want to tell everyone here that knowledge doesn't belong to the rich or the poor. It belongs to anyone willing to listen." The hall fell silent for a beat, the kind of silence where emotion hasn't yet found its way out, and then applause erupted, 200 rough hands of farmers and miners and homemakers clapping together, and Joe cried openly, without hiding, without needing to hide, because today she was allowed to take up space, allowed to make noise, allowed to exist. Emilio sat beside her, and on his lap Nico wriggled. Nico was now 14 months old, healthy, rosy-cheeked, big dark eyes like his father's, already walking, wobbling, falling and standing again, patient in a way Joe thought he might have inherited from Celeste, because it certainly wasn't from Emilio. As the applause filled the hall, Nico slid from his father's lap, tiny feet touching the floor, and he toddled toward the stage, toward Willa, down the aisle between the rows, wobbling, nearly falling twice, and the hall began to laugh because no one could help laughing at a 14-month-old determinedly walking toward the person he loved most in the world. Nico reached the foot of the stage, looked up at Willa, and raised his arms to be lifted, calling the name he had been calling her since his 12th month, the first word he learned after Dad, 2 syllables ringing through the microphone because Willa forgot to turn it off. Wee-wee. Willa laughed, bent down, lifted Nico onto her hip, and Nico buried his face in her neck, with the absolute trust of a child, toward the person who had saved his life, even if he didn't remember, and didn't need to remember because his body remembered, his heartbeat remembered, and the song about lavender fields Willa sang each night had become his breathing. The hall applauded again, louder and longer, and Joe watched her daughter on the stage, holding the baby whom circumstance should never have allowed her to meet, 2 children from 2 worlds, one in a new white dress and one in a onesie embroidered with the Caruso crest, and she thought of Dot, thought she was watching from somewhere, smiling with lips faintly scented of lavender, and speaking to Joe in a voice only Joe could hear. "See, my child, everything that heals grows from the earth, and everyone who heals grows from love." That night, after the opening ceremony, after the 200 people had gone home, and the valley sank into the quiet summer darkness of Appalachia, Joe stood on the balcony of the small hotel room where the family was staying, her head resting against Emilio's shoulder, looking out over the hillside where Dot lay beneath the earth that this spring had burst with wildflowers, as if the ground itself were tucking her in with a floral blanket. The night wind carried the scent of lavender from the garden behind the center, the garden Joe had personally replanted from the cuttings Dot left behind, and the smell was so familiar that Jo closed her eyes and saw herself at 6 years old, sitting on Dot's lap, Dot's hand resting on her hair, Dot's voice talking about medicinal plants in the early morning dew. Behind them, through the slightly open glass door, Willa and Nico slept in the same large bed. Willa lying on her side with one arm wrapped around Nico curled against her with the absolute trust of a child sleeping beside the person he loved most. And between the two children, on the bedside table, sat a small lavender pot Willa had picked from Dot's garden that afternoon, the plant releasing a soft fragrance into the dark room, the scent of memory, the scent of healing, the scent of 4 generations of women passing down something no money could buy and no violence could steal. Jo opened her eyes, looked up at the star-filled Appalachian sky, and spoke softly without looking at Emilio, her voice trembling slightly but warm. My grandmother used to say that being blessed meant having a roof over your head and food for your child. I believed that for 29 years, but tonight I understand she was wrong about one thing. Being blessed isn't having a roof. Being blessed is finally being seen. Emilio didn't speak. He only pulled her closer, his lips touching the crown of her head, and they stood there in the darkness with the scent of lavender and the steady breathing of the 2 children behind them and the hillside where Dot rested quietly before them. And Jo thought that if Dot could see her now, she'd say, "See, my child, you're already blessed." And this time, Jo believed it. The story of Jolene Mercer, of Willa, of Dot, and of Emilio Caruso ends here, but the lesson it leaves behind doesn't. The lesson that sometimes the person who saves us isn't the richest or the most powerful, but the one willing to truly see us when the whole world looks through us. The lesson that knowledge doesn't belong to universities or hospitals or people with degrees, but to anyone humble enough to listen, whether the teacher is an old woman gathering herbs on a hill or a 10-year-old girl in her mother's shirt. The lesson that being invisible doesn't mean being worthless, that the quietest people are sometimes the strongest, and that love doesn't need to be grand to be real. It only needs to be real to heal. If this story touched you, if you saw yourself in Jo, in Willa, in Dot, or in anyone who's ever felt invisible in a world too large, please share it with someone you think needs to hear it, like the video. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new emotional stories every day. We want to hear you. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever felt invisible in your life? Has anyone ever truly seen you when no one else did? Share with us in the comments. Tell us your story, because every story you share deserves to be heard, and we read every comment with all our hearts. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, peaceful days, and always remember that you deserve to be seen. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.